Pozdrav svima ljudi, evo nas u novom videu. Gost današnjeg videa ni manje ni više nego dr. Mike Israetel. Dobro ste čuli, evo snimili smo vam video, više neki oblik intervjua ili podcasta, ja sam šutio malte ne cijelo vrijeme, samo sam postavljao pitanje, jednostavno nisam ga htio prekidat, pošto čovjek je jedan od najvećih stručnjaka što se tiče fitnessa, ja sam osobno jako puno naučio iz njegovih knjiga i njegovih intervjua. Tako da preporučujem definitivno da pogledate njegov rad. Nadam se da ćete uživati, pričali smo o ozljedama, pričali smo o treningu u teretani, treningu za mišićni rast, izboru vježbi i slično. Tako da evo, lupite lajk i uživajte.
Hello everyone, my today's guest of my first podcast is Dr. Mike Israetel. He's Chief Sports Scientist, PhD in Sport Physiology, guy from the Renaissance periodization, and Professor of Exercise and Sports Science. Did I say everything good? I hope yes. So I prepared here some questions for him. This is, let's say, a synthesis of questions that I found interesting from his last interviews, from some books that he wrote. So I think this will be interesting. Some of the topics will be hypertrophy, obviously, injury prevention, relationship between strength training and hypertrophy training, and some mindset stuff, and what is his opinion on some regular stuff about his work. So I want to ask you first, I don't think that anyone asked you here on podcast or something. Some people like to say that you overcomplicate things, your volume, landmarks, MRV, MAV, and that stuff, that it's overcomplicated and it's enough to, okay, just train hard, bro, that mindset. What do you think about that, and why that kind of mindset is wrong?
Yeah, well, they have a good point, you know. If you're getting good results, sticking to the simple basics allows you to use your mental powers elsewhere for more productive gains rather than perseverating on minute details that make no difference or very small differences in your plan. But the requisite complexity you have to bring to a problem is often correlated to difficulty and intractability of the problem. That is to say, if we want to kick a ball into the air 100 feet, you just take the ball, you hit it with your foot, and there it goes. Success. You don't have to think about parabolic trajectories or exit velocities or anything insane. Now, if you want to launch a rocket to go to the moon, land on the moon, let astronauts walk around and come back, you're going to have an unbelievable amount of complexity to that task. Can you imagine someone walking into the USA's 1960s space program and saying, like, what are all these computers for? You guys are overcomplicating it. It's like, get the fuck out of here, you idiot. Who let you in here, right? So, you know, if the going is good, then train simple, train easy. Sometimes you'll reach plateaus and then you'll try to fix them in a variety of ways. First, the simple ways. And sometimes it'll work and then you're good to go. You can continue to apply very little intellect to what you're doing. Unfortunately, they don't work all the time. And when the simple doesn't work, you have to get incrementally a little bit more complicated in order to make sure that you've searched through all of the solution set to your problems and exhausted it so that you can either continue to grow or say, well, I'm not growing, but I've tried everything, right? And some of that part of everything is very complicated, and thus it requires some thinking that maybe is not obvious and can look like overcomplication to someone who's already making good gains, or at least tapping into the basics and making great gains. And to them, absolutely, it's overcomplicated. And as far as my intellectual produce on YouTube, for example, I have a lot of stuff that's really, really simple, and then stuff that's a little less simple, and then stuff that's very complicated. So I think a lot of people who make comments, which to me are always funny, like, this is overcomplicating things. Like, I suppose that to you it is, and why the fuck are you watching the video? Get fucked, go somewhere else, right? And then maybe if I have another video out that's nice and simple and you like it, oh, this is great, right? So it's to each their own. And if you want a certain level of complexity, if you feel that you have exhausted other options, you're going to be thankful someone's thinking about it deeply. So there's absolutely a role for deep thinking. If you don't need it, then it's okay.
Yes. It's probably also the level you are, which level you are. If you're a beginner, there is like less things to worry about than if you are intermediate or the advanced lifter. So it's also the stuff that we can say it's important in this context. So yes, I agree with you. I agree with your point. The next questions I want to ask you is a question that I often get. I filmed a video on YouTube like 2 months ago about this topic. So let's say that I want to get the biggest as possible. My only goal is hypertrophy. I want to be a bodybuilder. I don't care how much I lift. I don't care how much I lift on deadlift, squat, bench press, anything. I just want to hypertrophy and get the biggest I can be. So how much in the ratio my training should be in context of complex movements and isolation movements? Should I do like isolations only, because we know that stimulus to fatigue ratio and that stuff is better in isolation movements, less central nervous system, that stuff, and how much of that exercise should be compound? How should we program our training in that context?
So isolation exercises often have much less fatigue that they contribute, but they also have less stimulus. So the stimulus to fatigue ratio takes both into account. I don't believe it is a categorically true statement to say that the stimulus to fatigue ratio is better for isolations than compounds. So the real answer as to how many of which you pick is to pick things that have the highest stimulus to fatigue ratio. You're going to take an exercise or a muscle group rather, for example, your chest. After much experimentation for yourself, you're going to have a rank ordered list of maybe the top 5 best exercises as far as stimulus to fatigue ratio. Some of them will inevitably be compound and some will be isolation. And then you use them as necessary in order to maximize your training, because they're all high stimulus to fatigue ratio movements. They all work really well. And when you choose isolations versus compounds is more context dependent on how you want the time course of fatigue to go, what kind of access to equipment you have. Do you want to pre-exhaust a muscle potentially? Do you want to save assisting muscles for later? So for example, if you train chest in the AM and then shoulders and triceps in the PM, you could do a lot of compounds in the AM, but maybe you're better off starting with isolations and ending with isolations. Just hit the chest. You do a couple compounds as well, but that because you did a very limited number of compounds, your front delts and triceps aren't as tired as they would be if you did a bunch of compounds. So it's a little bit more context specific then. But generally speaking, looking at exercises as compound versus isolation, what's a good analogy here? It's like looking at pepper and salt. There's which one's better? That doesn't make any damn sense. How do you know how much pepper and salt to put in your food? Well, it's whatever makes it taste the best, right? And there's your answer. And there's all kinds of different combinations. Sometimes a lot of pepper, not a lot of salt. Sometimes the other way around, sometimes 50-50. And if you like pepper a lot, you'll be using a lot of pepper. If you like salt a lot, you'll be using more salt. Just the same way as if a compound really gets you a great stimulus to fatigue ratio, you may have no neat reason for isolations. On the other hand, if isolations give you a real good stimulus to fatigue ratio and they fit into the context of your program and they don't cause a lot of systemic fatigue and you're really sort of pushed close to your limits, then you may use more isolations. Some muscles are just better at being trained with isolations than compounds. For example, in my own training, quadriceps, I've noticed, require no isolation work whatsoever for nearly maximum, if not maximum development. I mean, how many people build big legs off of leg extensions? That's kind of a nonsensical thing. You can do high bar squats, hack squats, and leg presses properly in some lunges, and your quads are going to be as big as they can. It's all compounds, right? But then on the other hand, imagine trying to get the biggest biceps you can with only compounds. Geez, there's not a lot of compounds that are really limited by the biceps. Maybe underhand pull-ups, but even that's tough, and the rep range is really limited. And a lot of times your lats can actually help, and the biceps can be relatively inactive, and the lats can make up for the work or the pulling muscles of the back. So I think it should really just be done in an SFR ratio. If the stimulus to fatigue ratio is good and the muscle generates as much fatigue in such a way as to fit into the rest of your program, then you select compound or isolation if those two check marks are checked. And you should never dogmatically assign yourself a certain number of compounds versus isolations in order to hit some arbitrary ratio, which I don't believe exists.
What about low bar squats? What about conventional deadlifts for hypertrophy? Are these exercises can be designed for beginners in their hypertrophy program should be doing these exercises.
Yeah, they can if they'd like, if they have a high stimulus to fatigue ratio. The problem is for intermediates and advanced, they typically don't. So, you know, someone could be doing deadlifts for sets of 8, conventional. You can ask someone like this, what muscles does that work? And they're like, well, you know, the back, the traps, the glutes. You can ask the next question, like, are there other exercises that work those muscles as well with less fatigue? And they'd probably be like, yeah. And they're like, so why are you doing this? Just to save time? And they're like, nah, it's because I like to deadlift. And you're like, I see. So if you actually choose your exercises based on stimulus to fatigue ratio or raw stimulus magnitude, just how much muscle growth they cause, you're going to have collected a group of exercises that are very effective at hypertrophy. If you choose based on just, like powerlifters have big legs, I'll low bar squat. Well, it's funny because when powerlifters go into their off season to get bigger legs, they do hack squats, leg presses, and high bar squats and front squats. It's strange, right? So you're copying them at the very thing they don't want you to be copying them. It's like thinking that what makes a good chef is putting on a white chef's hat. It's like, no, it's the culinary education. So, and the chef could tell you that. So it's the people like to copy others without even knowing the reasoning behind what they're doing, and they're often led astray like that.
Yeah, I listened to your podcast that you talk last interview that you talked about professional bodybuilders and people who are doing these things and copying professional bodybuilders. Why recreational lifters shouldn't be looking to professionals, IBB pros and others, and just copy their workouts, and how in which context we should look on that stuff.
Yeah. So I think it's really good to know what the best in the field are doing, because they have a lot of wisdom, and you should be trying to understand why they do some of those things. And if once you understand them, if they make sense for your context, you should be adopting them. But if you try to understand them and they're either nonsensical, which is to say they don't make the most sense in the context of even what the bodybuilder's doing, or you understand them and properly understand that they're not for your level of training development, then you don't use them. For example, some bodybuilders don't do presses all the way down with a barbell. They stop at certain inches above the chest. And if you actually ask most of them why they do that, they say, you know, my shoulders are so messed up from years of training, I can't go all the way down. I would if I could get a better stretch on the pecs, but I can't. So why would you be copying someone that's injured as if they're training optimally? And it's insane. So anytime bodybuilders, professionals train, you want some insight as to why they're doing what they're doing. And if some of their insights may be wrong, so they'll say, you know, well, why don't you go all the way down and all the way up in your leg press? And they'll say, well, I can handle the most weight this way. And you say, well, aren't the internal forces pretty similar that the muscle generates? And also you get the stretch under tension and full motor unit recruitment and enhanced safety and maybe perhaps the simulation of other muscles, not just the quads, like the glutes and the sartorius, so on and so forth. And they'd be like, what the fuck are you talking about, pussy? And then you're like, oh, I'm speaking to a person who's not very intelligent or thoughtful. And then you can proceed to discount their advice to a certain degree based on how unintelligent you think they are. Or at least to be tempted to take less seriously what they're doing. You know, once you find out someone's not really a thinker, someone will say, hey, why does what's his name do that? You're like, I guarantee you he doesn't know, you know? So maybe they can stumble onto some things that are effective without being able to articulate them, which is nice. So you should always be attentive to what they're doing. I would never say, oh, pro bodybuilder XYZ does this. Like, who cares? I wouldn't say that. But I'd say, you know, let's find out why. And let's find out maybe why there are some good reasons and some bad. And then sometimes the reasons are mostly good, and then you can employ it in your own context. Sometimes the reasons are mostly bad, wholly bad, or non-existent. And then you have to be more careful about employing it in your own context.
Great point. When we shouldn't do full ROM. I saw your RP Plus video. I think you are the guy who mostly spread that full ROM stuff. And is there situations when we shouldn't do full range of motion? So if yes, which situations are those? Yeah.
For those curious for the longer explanation, I have a whole video on YouTube called The Case Against Full ROM. But the easy answer is when it doesn't maximize the stimulus to fatigue ratio. So for example, you know, if you're trying to train your chest, but going all the way down in a dumbbell press hurts your shoulders, thus the fatigue is higher, and it actually doesn't let you contract and feel your chest as much because at that depth, your chest kind of deactivates a little bit and your front delts turn on a little bit more. Then after an honest assessment and comparing it to a slightly more partial press, you realize that you get better tension, better burn, better pumps, better disruption, and less joint and connective tissue stress with a partial press. Then you should go with a partial press. So the stimulus to fatigue ratio is probably the number one arbiter of what you should be doing in the gym. That being said, full range of motion done properly coincides, I would say, 90% plus with the best stimulus to fatigue ratio. And I've myself have gone through this journey of discovery. It took me 20 fucking years. And almost everyone I've ever trained with and has come to train with me and my training partners and have tried full range of motion stuff, very rarely do they turn to us and go, nah, it's just not hitting my delts like I thought it would. They're usually like, oh my fucking God, I'm using 25 pounds and my delts are on fire. How is this possible? So stimulus to fatigue ratio is usually higher when you do full range of motion. But if it's not, then you shouldn't do the full range and should do a partial range that maximizes your stimulus to fatigue ratio.
Good point. I want to speak about injuries. What's the real reasons why injuries happen? A lot of people thinking that if their technique is like almost perfect or very good, they will be injury free. So what's the main factor causing injuries, and how can we program our training volume and intensity to prevent injuries to happen?
Bringing systems close to their breaking points, which is another way of saying overload, causes injuries fundamentally. If you never push it, you'll never get hurt, at least not in the gym. The problem is you have to push it, right? So then the only things we can say about how to manage injury is to push it in ways that are not completely insane and that allow you to push it, but still allow you to reduce the injury risk to some extent. One of the big ones is not ramping volume very quickly. So if you're used to doing 5 sets per workout for the chest, if you just go right to 10, that's stupid, which means one of the stupidest programs you could ever do is German volume training, which I would say borders not a program, but on a recipe for idiocy. German volume training is 10 by 10, just, out of whatever you were doing, just 10 by 10 now, which is kind of nuts. Another one is not escalating loads quickly. So for example, if you're used to deadlifting 400 for sets of 8, don't just go to 455 next week, go to 415, then 425, et cetera, et cetera. It's always a good idea. Getting out of your normal technical groove definitely contributes to injury. So sacrificing your technique to get another rep right when you're the most tired, bad news. Training chronically over your maximum recovery volume or very close to it, also a bad idea. So if you're really kind of super exhausted, super afraid your performance is starting to slip, you go into the gym and you just try to smash PRs, it's a good time for you to be getting hurt. So I think all of those taken into account, probably most of the reason why people get hurt and most of the ways to mitigate it is to take everything slowly and gradually and not make big jumps. And then when you're very fatigued, take a deload before you fall apart into pieces and not after.
Okay, good one. So let's say hypothetical situation, I'm on my bench press and my chest hurts. I can feel my tendon during the set. I still have 3 sets to do on my training. What should I do? Should I quit, go home, or should I do at least something? Should I make pause, or what do you think about it? What's the step in that situation?
So I would try to reduce the load on the bench press first and take it through a full range of motion and see if it's still persistent or if it gets worse. Sometimes what you think is an injury is just a random firing of nociceptive neurons or random firing in the brain that has nothing to do with your nociception. Sometimes it can be scar tissue dislocating and a bunch of other things that aren't really that bad. They're not really injuries. So a lot of times when you feel a little pain somewhere, you can rack the bar, take some weight off, and try again. Sometimes you're like, oh, I don't feel anything. And then you warm up again and you feel great, and then you have a great session. So I would say that's number one. If you start warming up again and it hurts more and more and more each rep and set, then it's probably time to leave that muscle alone for that workout. Come back the next workout and do a very, very easy recovery session where you do half the load or half the reps or a combination of both. And then you just leave. And then a couple workouts later, after that recovery session has been done, you probably feel a little bit better. And then you choose exercises for the pecs that have the least impact on that injury. And you start really light, higher rep, and you slowly decrease the reps and increase the load over weeks until you're back to normal using those new exercises. And then a month or several later, you can go back to the bench press and start low, working in slowly. And all of a sudden there's no injury and nothing to worry about. And you've fixed the problem. So that's probably the best sort of general course of events you want to execute.
It's cool. It's cool. Next question I have for you is about stretching. Should we stretch? If yes, how? If we want to get stronger in the gym, train for hypertrophy, strength training, and so on. If will stretching get our squat and deadlift better per se? So what do you think about that? Or should we just getting our form better, just making the movement more times, or should we spend our time on any kind of stretch?
Mm-hmm. If your ability to execute the lifts is limited by your mobility and flexibility, then yeah, stretching may play a role. But other things play a role as well, as doing the movements and going a little bit deeper each time, essentially stretching with the movements themselves. Working on your technique to try to have the proper hip position. So for example, a lot of people think they're not flexible enough to do a very good sumo deadlift. But for at least half those people, it's just that they're not pointing their knees, their toes, and their hips in the right direction. And they're not getting close enough to the bar. Once they do that, they're like, oh, wow, this is great. I actually can do this. So some people need flexibility, but there has to be a need. Just getting more flexible won't make you any stronger unless the problem with your strength is a lack of flexibility. So for example, if you can't grab the deadlift bar without your back rounding, and you know that once your back rounds, you lose 50 kilos off of your lift, you have a problem. And maybe flexibility training, including stretching, can ameliorate that over time. But if you have no problem getting into the perfect deadlift position, flexibility is not your problem.
Mm-hmm. Next question I have for you. You are now in contest prep. If I seen it well, you are now cutting. What do you think about bodybuilding and orthorexia? I've done contest prep as my own, and I know how it was after it. So, what are your experiences with binge eating? What are your experiences with all of that stuff that goes with strict dieting?
Yeah, it's real. The majority of people don't experience it, but a pretty decent minority does. There are ways to make that less and more likely. If you cut your calories like crazy and really overdo it, it makes it more likely. If you take regular cheat meals and you're the kind of person that probably shouldn't be having them because they're very tempting, makes it more likely, and so on down the line. There is a certain amount of food focus that is okay to have and is subclinical and can't get you diagnosed with orthorexia. So it's okay to have that towards the end of a prep, and it's okay to have that after a prep. And you can still use your logic and reason to slowly ease into cheating afterwards. And after a few weeks or a few months, you'll be 100% fine. Some individuals don't have that easy of a situation, so they struggle considerably and may need to reach out for professional dietary and psychological help. What I would say is the best way to approach the situation at the front end is before you ever diet someone down for a contest, which is really kind of brutal. You probably want to give them a shorter diet of 8 to 12 weeks, just a diet to get much leaner than they are, and then maintain them for a while and see how they do. And if that diet takes heaven and earth psychologically to execute, I would delay the show until and unless they mature psychologically or change somehow. But if that diet they just knock out of the park and they don't feel anything so wrong, take a maintenance of 3 or 4 months, and then the next diet can be a show diet if they're close enough to be lean for that. So I think the best way to obviate a lot of those problems is to find the people that will experience such problems and not let them run into the flames. So.
Is it possible to be on a flexible diet and contest prep at the same time? Like have a 20% of your calories intake or some junk food, let's say, and still, is it practical thing to do?
Yeah, sure. It's not for everyone though, because some people, when they have a little bit of junk food, it makes them really hungry for more. And sometimes the selection of what junk food to eat gives them decision fatigue. Whereas if they just did what they were supposed to do with a pre-programmed diet, they could just say, okay, this is my diet. It doesn't change, or it changes in very predictable ways. And my food is no longer a source of fun for me, and other things can be instead. And then all of a sudden, it's something you don't have to think about or worry about or So did I overdo it? Should I have a Snickers bar, a Milky Way bar? And some people really are better off doing the flexible approach. Many people, probably most in a contest diet, are worse off doing it. So I would recommend against it at face value and only allow it / recommend it based on a very clear need and a very clear history of it working for the person.
Mm-hmm. So what's your current, for the end, I asked you everything, but when I want to ask you, how is your prep going? Your training, how is it going? And when are you planning to compete? What's your plans for this season in case of all current situation about COVID and that stuff?
I was planning to compete maybe about a month ago, and I got COVID-19 instead, so I couldn't compete. Then I have a show planned 4 days from now. Mm-hmm. So we begin manipulating water and stuff like that for it. And
how's that going? If it's not secret, what are you currently doing?
What do you mean doing?
Peak week and stuff. You're still
that's wildly complicated. Yeah. So I'm currently at something like 8,000 milligrams of sodium per day, 9 liters of water per day. Wednesday, the water comes down to 2 to 3 liters. The sodium comes down to trace. Thursday, I keep the water and sodium low and start carbing up. I carb up all the way through the middle of Friday. In the second half of Friday, I consume as little food as possible to stay in a low stress, low hunger environment so that my abdominal region can not be bloated for the day of the show. And then Saturday, I compete. So it's basically, for me, my body takes a long time to lose body water. It's always on a delay. And whatever changes we make take half a day or a day to actually show themselves. So that meal by meal, hour by hour shit doesn't work for me. So we're taking it nice and far ahead of time and seeing how it goes. So fun.
That's it. Yeah, I miss my competing days. I think that I'm next year I'm going to the stage again. Cool. So yes, that's it, Dr. Mike. Thank you very much for the interview. Thank you very much for all this information. I'll post this on my YouTube channel. I post it on my Instagram. So that's it.
Tag me.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
I will.
All right. Take care.